The Mongol engineer pressed his shoulder into the weight of the leather shield above him, its thick layers of stitched hide absorbing the heat and debris raining down from the city walls. Around him, the rhythm of iron striking earth was steady, almost mechanical. This was routine. It had always been routine. From the plains of Central Asia to the edges of Eastern Europe, this method had broken cities that had stood for centuries. Dig beneath the walls. Pack the tunnel with timber. Burn it. Watch stone collapse. Move on. There was no urgency in his movements, no fear. There never was. The Mongols didn't fear walls. They erased them. At first, the sound barely registered, a faint scraping above, like loose rubble shifting. No one stopped working. Why would they? They had done this 100 times before. Then a hand gripped his arm, tight enough to hurt. He looked up. Something was descending through a narrow gap in the leather overhead. Not a rock. Not boiling oil. An iron sphere, heavy, deliberate, hanging from a chain. A thin trail of smoke curled from a small opening in its surface. For a split second, no one moved. There was no training for this. No instinct to rely on. The shield that had always protected them now trapped them. Then it detonated. Not like fire. Not like anything they understood. The air itself seemed to tear apart. Iron became a storm, shards moving faster than arrows, ripping through leather, armor, and bone as if none of it existed. When the dust settled, there was nothing left beneath the wall. The Mongols had faced every weapon the world could offer. They had never encountered anything like this. By the early 13th century, the Mongol Empire had become something the world had never seen before, a machine of conquest so efficient, so relentless, that entire civilizations seemed to collapse the moment it turned its attention toward them. What began as a confederation of nomadic tribes under Genghis Khan had transformed into a force that stretched from the edges of the Pacific to the borders of Europe. Cities didn't just fall to the Mongols. They disappeared. Armies didn't just lose, they were erased. Their strength wasn't just in numbers, but in discipline, mobility, and an unmatched ability to adapt. They learned from every enemy they defeated, absorbing technologies, tactics, and specialists into their own ranks. Engineers from China, Persia, and beyond became part of the Mongol war machine, refining siege techniques that made even the strongest fortifications feel temporary. By the time Genghis Khan died, the foundation had been laid for an empire that would continue expanding with terrifying momentum under his successors. One of their most significant victories came in 1215 with that of Zhongdu, the capital of the Jin dynasty, modern-day Beijing. After a prolonged and brutal siege, the city fell, followed by widespread destruction that sent a clear message to the rest of the world. Resistance was not just futile, it was catastrophic. The Jin court understood this better than anyone. They gathered what remained of their power, their treasury, and their people, and retreated south to Kaifeng. Kaifeng was not just another city. It was one of the largest and most prosperous urban centers in the world at the time, protected by massive walls rising nearly 30 feet high and stretching for miles. More importantly, it became the last symbol of Jin resistance, the final line between survival and total collapse. For the Mongols, taking Kaifeng wasn't just another objective. It was the end of a campaign that had spanned decades. For the Jin, it was everything. What followed was not a quick conquest, but a grinding war of attrition. For nearly 20 years, the conflict dragged on, draining resources, lives, and patience on both sides. The Mongols, accustomed to decisive victories, found themselves locked in a slow, methodical struggle. The Jin, despite repeated losses, refused to break completely. They adapted, fortified, and waited. By 1230, that stalemate had reached its limit. Ogedei Khan, Genghis Khan's successor, made a decision that would bring the conflict to its climax. He committed overwhelming force to crush the Jin once and for all. Massive Mongol armies advanced, converging on the heart of Jin territory with a level of coordination that few in history could match. In early 1232, at the Battle of Sanfeng Mountain, the last major Jin field army, hundreds of thousands strong, was surrounded and destroyed. With organized resistance shattered, the path to Kaifeng was open. Command of the final campaign fell to one of the most formidable military minds of the era, Subutai. By this point in his life, Subutai was not just a general, he was a legend. He had spent decades on continuous campaigns, leading forces across continents, defeating armies that outnumbered him, and executing strategies that are still studied today. He didn't rely on brute force alone. He understood timing, logistics, and psychological pressure better than anyone. When Subutai arrived outside Kaifeng in April 1232, he brought with him not just an army, but inevitability. The siege lines stretched for miles, sealing the city off from the outside world. Inside those walls were over 1 million people, soldiers, civilians, refugees, all dependent on supplies that would not last forever. By every conventional measure, the outcome was already decided. The Mongols had never failed to take a city they committed to. They had never been stopped by walls, no matter how high or how strong. History pointed in only one direction. Kaifeng was supposed to fall like everything else. But this time, something was different. When Subutai's forces closed in around Kaifeng in the spring of 1232, the siege did not begin with chaos or dramatic assault, but with something far more dangerous: precision. The Mongols did what they always did. They sealed the city. Supply routes were cut with methodical efficiency, roads were controlled, and every possible exit was monitored. The siege lines stretched for miles, forming an iron ring around one of the largest cities on Earth. Nothing came in. No one got out. At first, life inside Kaifeng continued with a fragile sense of normalcy. Markets still functioned, officials still issued orders, and soldiers still stood watch along. The towering walls. But beneath that surface, pressure was building. The city was never designed to sustain over 1 million people under total isolation. Refugees had poured in over the years, fleeing Mongol advances, turning Kaifeng into a crowded sanctuary that now felt more like a sealed container. Days turned into weeks, and the cracks began to show. Food was the first problem. Supplies that might have lasted months under normal conditions were consumed at an unsustainable rate. Rationing became stricter, then desperate. Prices surged beyond reach. What had once been common became scarce, and what was scarce became priceless. Hunger doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps in, slowly, quietly, until it becomes impossible to ignore. Sanitation followed close behind. With so many people confined within the walls, waste accumulated faster than it could be managed. Water sources became contaminated. Illness spread, at first in isolated cases, then in waves. In a city that size, disease doesn't just spread, it multiplies. And there was no escape from it. Outside the walls, the Mongols remained patient. They didn't need to rush. Time was their ally. This was the part of warfare they had mastered just as well as open battle, the ability to let pressure do the killing. Siege engines would eventually come. Mining operations would weaken the walls. But even without them, the outcome seemed inevitable, because this is how sieges worked. Not just in Asia, but across the entire medieval world. No matter how strong the walls, no matter how determined the defenders, the equation rarely changed. A city cut off from supply would eventually collapse under its own weight. Starvation, disease, and exhaustion would accomplish what armies could not. It was a slow kind of defeat, but a certain one. Inside Kaifeng, the leadership understood this reality. They knew the numbers. They knew the limits of their reserves. And they knew exactly who they were up against. This wasn't just another invading force. This was the Mongol Empire, the same force that had crushed kingdoms, shattered alliances, and reduced entire regions to silence. There was no historical precedent for surviving this. From the outside, the situation looked almost predetermined. The strongest army in the world had surrounded a city that could not sustain itself indefinitely. The defenders were outnumbered, outmatched, and cut off. Every known rule of warfare pointed in one direction. Kaifeng was going to fall. It wasn't a question of if, only when. And yet, within those walls, something was being prepared that didn't follow any of those rules. Something that didn't rely on tradition, or numbers, or even survival. Something the Mongols had never planned for. For centuries before the Mongols ever appeared outside Kaifeng, Chinese engineers had been experimenting with something unusual: gunpowder. It wasn't new, and it certainly wasn't mysterious. Armies had used it in crude ways for generations. Fire arrows that streaked across the sky, small explosive charges wrapped in paper or bamboo. Devices meant more to frighten than to destroy. They were loud, dramatic, sometimes effective, but fundamentally limited. When they ignited, they burst outward instantly, releasing energy too quickly to concentrate real force. Spectacle, not precision. Noise, not transformation. But inside Kaifeng, under the pressure of annihilation, someone asked a different question. Not how to make the explosion bigger, but how to make it last longer. How to trap it. How to force that energy to build instead of dissipate. It was a subtle shift in thinking, but it changed everything. What if the casing didn't break the moment the powder ignited? What if it resisted just long enough? The answer came in the form of cast iron. Instead of fragile containers, gene engineers created sealed iron spheres, dense and unforgiving, packed tightly with refined gunpowder mixtures. When the fuse burned down and the charge ignited inside that enclosed space, the reaction had nowhere to go. Pressure didn't escape, it multiplied. Rapidly. Violently. Beyond anything seen before. And then, in a single instant, the iron didn't crack open. It failed all at once. Not an explosion as the world understood it, but something far more lethal. The sphere vanished, replaced by a storm of metal fragments traveling faster than any arrow ever fired. Each piece carried the full force of the compressed blast, slicing through armor, wood, and flesh with terrifying efficiency. This wasn't just an improvement. It was a new category of weapon entirely, the first true fragmentation device in recorded history. The gene called it the Thunder Crash Bomb. And for the Mongols, it changed the rules of the battlefield overnight. The effects were immediate and devastating. Siege engines that had rolled unchallenged toward city walls for decades were torn apart before they could even be deployed. Units advancing in tight formation found themselves shredded in seconds, their armor offering no meaningful protection against high-velocity iron shards. Even distance, once a reliable buffer in siege warfare, became uncertain. The blast radius extended far enough to make proximity itself a risk calculation. But what made this weapon truly disruptive wasn't just its raw power, it was how it was used. Gene forces didn't deploy these bombs randomly. They studied Mongol tactics and targeted their vulnerabilities with precision. When siege towers approached, bombs were launched from trebuchets, turning carefully constructed machines into burning wreckage. When Mongol engineers attempted to tunnel beneath the walls, a method that had never failed them, gene defenders adapted. They lowered these iron bombs directly into the tunnels, into enclosed spaces where the blast couldn't dissipate. The result was catastrophic. The very shelters designed to protect Mongol sappers became sealed chambers of destruction. The leather screens that had once deflected fire and debris offered no defense against an internal blast that turned confined air into a weapon. In those moments, experience meant nothing. Training meant nothing. The system they had trusted across continents no longer worked. For the first time, the Mongols weren't just facing resistance. They were facing something they didn't understand. And in warfare, that changes everything. If the Thunder Crash Bomb shattered the Mongols' sense of physical security, the next weapon struck something deeper, their confidence. Because what the defenders of Kaifeng unleashed next wasn't just another explosive. It was personal, close range, impossible to ignore. They called it the Fire Lance. At first glance, it looked almost primitive, a tube made of bamboo or layered paper, no more than a few feet long, carried by infantry like a short spear. But inside that simple frame was a carefully packed mixture of gunpowder, sulfur, and fragments of metal and ceramic. When ignited, it didn't explode outward in a single burst. It sustained. A continuous jet of flame roared from the end of the tube, extending several feet, accompanied by a spray of burning particles that tore into anything at close range. This wasn't a weapon meant to intimidate from a distance. It was designed for proximity, for moments when two sides were close enough to see each other's faces. In those moments, The fire lance transformed the battlefield into something unfamiliar. Fire didn't just fall from above anymore. It came at you directly, aggressively, carried in the hands of someone advancing toward you. And the Jin didn't use it cautiously. During one night operation, under the cover of darkness, a small unit of Jin soldiers armed entirely with fire lances moved beyond the safety of the city walls. They navigated terrain that should have been controlled by Mongol patrols, slipping into the outer edges of the Mongol camp. There were no drums, no warning, no formation lines. Then the flames erupted. In the confusion of night, visibility collapsed instantly. Tents caught fire. Horses panicked. The controlled structure of the Mongol camp, something that had been a strength in every campaign, became a liability in seconds. Fire lances didn't just burn, they disoriented. The combination of light, heat, and flying debris made it nearly impossible to determine where the attack was coming from or how large it was. By the time a coordinated response began to form, the damage had already been done. Dozens, possibly hundreds, were dead or injured. And just as quickly as they had appeared, the Jin soldiers withdrew, leaving behind fire, smoke, and something far more disruptive than casualties: uncertainty. For an army like the Mongols, that mattered. This was a force that had built its dominance not only on superior tactics, but on psychological control. They moved faster, struck harder, and created fear in their enemies before a battle even began. Entire cities surrendered at the mere possibility of facing them. Their reputation was a weapon. But now, for the first time, that dynamic had shifted. The thunder crash bombs had already proven that the Mongols were no longer untouchable. The fire lances reinforced it at a human level. These were not distant threats launched from walls. These were weapons that met them face to face, that invaded their space, that disrupted their sense of control. And the historical accounts are unusually clear on this point. Mongol soldiers, men who had charged heavily armored cavalry, who had fought across continents without hesitation, began to feel something they rarely experienced. Not caution, not adjustment, fear. Not overwhelming, not paralyzing, but present. Real enough to change behavior. Real enough to force hesitation where there had once been certainty. Because fear in warfare doesn't require defeat. It only requires doubt. And for the first time in their rise to dominance, the Mongols were beginning to question what they were up against. Subutai had spent a lifetime winning battles that others considered unwinnable, and he understood something most commanders never fully grasp. When a strategy stops working, persistence becomes a liability. Outside Kaifeng, the signs were clear. Direct assaults were costing too much. Siege towers were being destroyed before they could close the distance. Tunnels, once the Mongols' most reliable method, had turned into death traps. The weapons inside the city weren't just effective, they were disruptive in ways that made traditional siege tactics increasingly inefficient. So Subutai did what great strategists do. He changed the game. The focus shifted away from breaking the walls and toward breaking the city itself. The Mongol lines tightened, transforming the siege into a complete blockade. Every road, every supply path, every possible point of contact with the outside world was sealed with precision. There would be no dramatic breach, no decisive clash at the gates. Instead, there would be time, slow, relentless, and unforgiving. Inside Kaifeng, time became the enemy. Food supplies, already strained, began to collapse under the weight of a population that had nowhere else to go. Rations shrank to the point of desperation. What little remained was hoarded, traded, fought over. Starvation does not announce itself with sudden violence, it erodes. It weakens judgment, breaks discipline, and turns survival into the only priority that matters. Disease followed closely behind. Overcrowding, contaminated water, and failing sanitation systems created the perfect conditions for outbreaks that spread faster than any army could move. In a city packed with over 1 million people, illness didn't just spread, it compounded. Every day more fell sick. Every day, fewer could fight. The weapons that had once given the Jin an edge could not stop this. Thunder crash bombs could destroy siege engines. Fire lances could repel attackers. But neither could create food. Neither could cleanse water. Neither could hold back time. Leadership inside the city understood the reality, even if they could not admit it publicly. Emperor Aizong faced a decision that no ruler wants to make: stay and risk total annihilation, or leave and preserve what little remained of the dynasty. In late 1232, he chose survival, at least in the short term. Under the cover of secrecy, he slipped out of Kaifeng with his court, relocating to another stronghold in a final attempt to continue resistance. What remained behind was a city already on the edge. Without the emperor, without hope of reinforcement, and with conditions deteriorating by the day, the path forward narrowed to a single outcome. Negotiations began, not from a position of strength, but necessity. On May 29, 1233, after more than a year under siege, the gates of Kaifeng opened. The Mongols entered not through a shattered wall, but through surrender. It wasn't the ending anyone inside the city had fought for, but it was the only one left. The Jin dynasty did not collapse immediately. It lingered, fractured and weakened, for another year. But the loss of Kaifeng marked the point of no return. By 1234, with Mongol forces closing in alongside their allies, the final remnants of the dynasty were extinguished. Emperor Aizong, facing inevitable capture, chose to end his own life rather than surrender. On the surface, the outcome looked familiar. The Mongols had won again. Another empire had fallen. Another chapter in their expansion had been completed. But something fundamental had changed. They had not won the way they always had. They had been forced to adapt, to step back, to abandon methods that had carried them across continents. And more importantly, they had encountered a form of resistance that did not rely on numbers or tradition, but on innovation. The weapons developed inside Kaifeng did not save the Jin dynasty. They could not overcome starvation, disease, and isolation. But they did something arguably more important. They exposed a limit. They proved that even the most powerful military force in the world could be challenged, not by strength alone, but by ideas. And once that door was opened, it could never be closed again. History often remembers outcomes. Who won? Who lost? Which empire rose, and which one disappeared? But the moments that actually changed the world rarely look decisive in real time. They're subtle, easy to overlook, and Kaifeng was one of those moments. Because this wasn't just a story about the Mongols defeating the Jin dynasty. That had already been written the moment the siege began. What happened at Kaifeng was something deeper. A shift in the balance between raw power and human ingenuity. For decades, the Mongol war machine had represented the absolute peak of military dominance. Speed, coordination, discipline, combined with a ruthless ability to adapt, made them virtually unstoppable. They didn't just defeat armies, they rendered entire systems of defense obsolete. Walls, fortifications, traditional tactics, none of it had been enough. Until it was challenged in a completely different way. The defenders of Kaifeng didn't outnumber the Mongols. They didn't outmaneuver them in the field. What they did instead was rethink the problem entirely. They took something that already existed, gunpowder, and pushed it beyond its current limits. They didn't invent from nothing. They innovated under pressure. And that distinction matters. Because from that point forward, warfare would no longer be defined solely by numbers, training, or even strategy. It would be shaped by ideas. By who could adapt faster. By who could turn knowledge into advantage before their opponent even understood what had changed. The Mongols recognized this almost immediately. They had built their empire by absorbing what worked, regardless of where it came from. And just like they had done with siege engineering from earlier conquests, they began to integrate gunpowder technology into their own campaigns. What had once been used against them would soon travel with them, westward, across Persia, into the Islamic world, and eventually into Europe. And when it arrived, it didn't just influence warfare, it redefined it. The assumptions that had held medieval society together for centuries began to break down. Castles that once symbolized security became vulnerable. Heavy cavalry, the elite force of its time, faced threats it wasn't designed to counter. Power started to shift away from tradition and toward those who could control and develop emerging technology. What began as an act of desperation inside a besieged city became the foundation of something much larger, the early stages of the Gunpowder Age. And that's the real lesson of Kaifeng. Not that a weaker force can always defeat a stronger one. Because in this case, it didn't. The Jin dynasty still fell. The Mongols still won. But victory didn't look the same anymore. For the first time, the most powerful army in the world was forced to confront a simple reality: dominance has limits. And those limits are often defined not by strength, but by imagination. Because in the end, it wasn't just a battle between two forces. It was a turning point where technology began to rewrite the rules of power itself. What happened at Kaifeng is easy to misunderstand if you only look at the ending. An empire fell. Another expanded. On paper, it feels like just another chapter in the long story of conquest. But if you look closer, at the hesitation, at the adaptation, at the moment the unstoppable had to rethink its own approach, you start to see something far more important. Because history isn't shaped only by victories. It's shaped by inflection points. Moments where the rules quietly change even if the outcome doesn't. Kaifeng was one of those moments. It proved that even the most dominant system in the world can be disrupted, not by matching its strength, but by redefining the game it's playing. That idea doesn't belong to the 13th century. It's timeless. Whether you're building a business, creating something from nothing, or competing in a space where the odds don't favor you, the lesson is the same. You don't win by playing the same game better. You win by seeing what others don't, and acting on it before they understand it. That's what this channel is about. Not just history as a series of events, but history as a collection of turning points. Moments where one decision, one innovation, or one shift in thinking changed everything that came after. If this story made you think differently, you're exactly where you need to be. Subscribe, and you won't miss the next one. And if there's a moment in history you think deserves to be explored, something overlooked, misunderstood, or forgotten, leave it in the comments. Because the most important stories are often the ones no one is telling. I'll see you in the next video.